I'm going to do what nobody has done. It's not politically correct in this country to talk about black people and black issues. Nobody wants to hear about it. That's why you can't have black studies in any schools. Nobody wants to hear about black folks' problems. That's what, keep it low, keep it quiet. Let's pretend that they don't exist. And when I speak about black issues and white issues, I'm not speaking about hate. I don't want black people to think that they should go out and hate anybody. I don't want whites to think that blacks, by addressing black issues, that somehow black folks getting ready to attack you and become all terrorists against you. And I'm gonna start out first by telling you this. You cannot solve a problem. You can solve no problems on this earth unless you first of all understand the history of the problem. Here's the problem, that historically in this society, black folk have not moved one iota than where they were in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. In a comparative proportional term, black people are exactly where they were on the eve of the Civil War. And the eve of the Civil War, at that particular time, we had approximately 300,000 black people that were free in this country, or quasi-free, having come out of slavery. And that was out of 5 million black folk. And that 300,000 black people had mysteriously and miraculously accomplished and acquired one half of 1% of this nation's wealth. Now here you are 150 years later, and black people still only have and own 1/2 of 1% of the nation's wealth after 150 years. Now what does that mean for you in terms? There's only 3 things that any given individual can do to earn a living in our society. They either work up here and have a business, or they have a job. They don't have that, they must move down to the second level. When you move down to the second level, you must go on welfare or food stamps or some kind of public assistance. If conservatives come along and knock you off of that, you must go to the third level. You must steal, go into crime. Every individual must either work, go on welfare, or steal, an elaboration, a combination, or sophistication of those 3 things. You can't do anything else unless you evaporate and disappear. We live in a society that don't want to understand it, don't want to play games about it. Now what are the real issues again back in 1860? You don't own and control enough wealth. Why? Because you see, slavery did not happen to black folk by accident. It was inflicted on them intentionally to do something. What was inflicted on blacks to do? It was intentionally inflicted on blacks to maldistribute almost 100% of all this nation's wealth, power, resource, businesses, income, and controls of all levels of government. That was the point of slavery. It has never been corrected or addressed. All of a sudden, when black folk came out of slavery in 1865, how did they come out? They came out penniless, poor. No food, no animals, no land, no resources, no tools, no religion, no organization, nothing. All they were told is go out now, you're free, go out and compete. Compete with what? Compete with what? They said, well, you can jump high and run faster. Black folk had nothing coming out of slavery to compete with and to play the game, because you see, slavery has systematically, socially engineered them into the lowest level of a real-life monopoly game. And see, prior to the end of the Civil War, the greatest wealth builder in this nation was the back of a slave. When the wealth building in this nation shifted from the back of a slave to Wall Street, they set up a new game. It was called Monopoly. Now, and what black folk have been systematically lured into is a real-life monopoly game. Now, the monopoly game is based on some primary concepts. One is that you must be able to all sit down at the table, and everybody's supposed to get a fair share of the money. Once you get a fair share of the money, then you got a right to go around the table and try to buy land. But you want to buy the most valuable land and the best location of the land. Or you take your money and you buy basic businesses in the monopoly game, like the water company, electric company, and the railroad line. But you see, when black folk, they got out of slavery, they did not get their 40 acres and a mule, nor the $100. And see, the Republican, radical Republicans, the liberals in the Republican Party at that time, said, that was Benjamin Thaddeus Stevens and Sumter said on the floor of the United States Congress, that there's only going to be one thing that black folk will ever be in America. They're either going to be slaves or they're going to be free. But they cannot be free unless minimally they have 40 acres, a mule, and $100. But they didn't get it. But by then they were trapped into a real-life monopoly game. So now what blacks are doing are going around the real-life board, trying to play real life Monopoly with no money, no wealth. And all they do is go around the board and hope they'll land on free park or income tax refund. And if you play that way, sooner or later playing that real life game, you're gonna land what? On the wrong person's property, and you're either gonna go to jail or go broke and get out of the game. And that's why black folk right now are making a major impact on the prison system, the criminal system in this country. Because I looked around in 1860, for instance, I looked at all the major cities in the United States. And that's like Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Georgia, Savannah, Georgia, Richmond, Virginia, New York, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Brook. Guess what? Even though you had less than 300,000 black people that were free or quasi-free, black people made up over 51% of all the prisoners. 51% of all the prisoners, and out of 5 million, only 300,000 of you were even free. And here we are, 150 years later, and guess what? You still make up over 51% of the prisoners. So when I hear all my civil rights leaders and all my civil rights friends, I don't care what it's Al, Jesse, keep talking about, we've come a long way. You haven't gone any place. And quit BSing people and bamboozling people and black folk about how far we've come. You haven't come any place. You're still sitting in the same identical spot. As my mother would say, you haven't got a pot or one to throw it out of. That's why our dilemma. We do not have any wealth. Now, I indicated to you a few minutes ago that the whole process of slavery maldistributed almost 100% of all this nation's wealth, power, resource, privileges, and controls of all levels of government into the hands of the dominant white society. Now, what does that mean in tangible terms? That when you only got 1/2 or 1% of the wealth, how can you compete with 1/2 or 1% of the wealth? When in this society right now, today, 150 years later, the average white person in America as a group got 3,500 times more money than the average black person. The average white has 3,500 times more money than the average black. I got 2 whites right now, some of them I know, they got more wealth than all 42 million black people put together. How, if 2 white men got more wealth than all 42 million black folk put together, what kind of game are you playing? What are you gonna do? How can you compete? As a matter of fact, let me move it off to men, let's move it to gender. For every dollar that a black woman has to run a household, the white woman has $100 to run a household. You're supposed to have enough money to be able to be self-sufficient. And this is true all around the world. Not just with blacks in this country. If I were look at you got approximately 25 to 26% of the population is black around the earth. And you got over $300 trillion in wealth on the earth. And out of that $300 trillion, if I take all the African countries, the Caribbean countries, and Latin America, put them together, you still have 1/2 or 1% of the wealth out of 300 trillion. I go down to South Africa. And I've spoken in all these countries, and I've had trade missions in Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Bermuda, Barbados, all these, Venezuela, Colombia. I've been to all these countries, heading up trade missions, representing presidents and governors. You can't compete in South Africa. In South Africa, with something like about 29 million blacks as an example, as a comparative example. 29 million blacks in South Africa. You got a little over 2 million whites. But guess what? They own almost 100% of all the wealth in Africa, the 2 million whites. As a matter of fact, in Africa, the De Beers family, one white family, the De Beers family, owns over 50% of the whole wealth of Africa. That means all the gold, silver, chrome, bauxite, magnesium, land, property, everything. And you want to know why they can't make it in Africa? They don't own and control anything. And so in America, if we're going to be a competitive group, we got to go back to what is the basic problem we can deal with. The biggest problem with blacks right now, they own no wealth. They control absolutely nothing. Not in the United States, not in Grand Rapids. I don't have to go. So black folk don't have enough wealth to be a competitive group. You cannot compete. That's the first problem. Now that you know what the problem is. The problem is a lack of wealth. And I'm going to get later on, I'm going to tell you how blacks should start getting wealth. Now, what's the second problem? The second problem is you got impediments that have consistently been used and imposed on black folk to make sure they don't get any wealth. But what you have in this society, we have a public policy that went into effect in 1867 when the 15th Amendment was enacted. The 15th Amendment says black people can now run for a public office. If you run for a public office and get into the public arena, there are some taboos that you cannot do. One, you cannot run for public office as a black person and talk about black issues. Point one. Point two, you cannot come into a public office and talk about groupism. You must always talk about individualism, individual achievement. And point three, you cannot come into a public office and try to hold the dominant white society accountable for slavery and what they've done to you for 500 years through Jim Crow, segregation, and slavery. That means you can't have reparations. Now, if any of you try to do it, you'll be charged with racism, or reverse racism. But nobody ever admits you cannot have a reverse racism unless you got a forward racism. And they don't understand what racism is. So when we start talking in a few minutes about solutions, understand clearly that it is impossible in theory and practice for a black person to be a racist. It is totally, absolutely impossible. When I listen to the Fox channel, I say you can't be that stupid and go to college unless you're using Gorilla Glue and got a certificate for being stupid. You cannot have a black person as a racist. All black people can do is react to racism. They're not racist. Racism is a power concept, point one, and two, it's a group concept. To be able to be a racist, you must belong to the group that has the power and the wealth. And it's a group-based concept. I'm going to divert over for a second just to give you a little piece of information. Racism never existed on the earth until the 1500s. The same time capitalism came into effect, and we'll talk about that also. Racism never existed. During the 1400s, European societies were devastated with crime, poverty, and diseases. Capitalism, in the simplest definition, in the 1500s, it says learning, acquiring, own, and control the land, the tools, the resources, and use other people's labor to enrich yourself. That's what capitalism is. I'm going to tell it to you again. It means learn how to acquire and control and own the land, the resources and tools, and use other people's labor to enrich yourself. That's capitalism. But what has happened now in the black community is through impediments is that we've been bamboozled by a lot of the black leadership in this country to having black folk focus strictly on civil rights and social integration. Social integration has failed in this country for black folk. It's the worst thing that ever happened to black folk. Black folk went backwards with social integration. What black folk lost almost everything they had during the process of social integration. President Nixon then when he got elected to office, he got a letter from Daniel Moynihan saying, I got a way to shut down the black civil rights movement in the country and shut down the black power movement. He said, what you do, you take the focus in public policy off of black folk and never put it back again. You place it on minority women and immigrants. And so at that point, I was opposed to that, but that's what they did. They shifted the focus, and they call that a benign neglect policy, which means that don't say anything mean about black folk, just pretend that they don't exist. And then they come up with this whole concept called post-racism and a colorblind society, and say the Constitution is colorblind. The Constitution was never colorblind. The Constitution is always very specific, saying you all are going to be slaves, and you all can be owners. The Constitution was never colorblind. And the American dream, what you hear about all the time, was based on anybody coming from Europe. They were advertising all over Europe. Come to America, we give you free land and free labor. And they set up a franchising system to make sure anybody came to America can get free land and free labor. Black folk, again, were not in the system. They were underneath the system. They never got the free land. They never got free labor. They were the labor force. And so by the 1960s, when Moynihan's memo went out, blacks were an obsolete, abandoned labor class. Our black civil rights leaders bought into the concept of focusing now not on black folk, but on minority, women and children, people of color, multicultural, diversity, anything other than black folk. Now it's moved over to gay and transsexuals.